Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with If I Could Choose Only One Work by composer D, it would have to be work Q. Well, composer D is none other than Max Bruch. Max Bruch, yes. And work Q is not the First Violin Concerto. Not even close. Well, it is close because it's a violin work. It's his Scottish fantasy for violin and orchestra. Now, why did I pick it? Well, as you know, the reason we're dealing with this is that we have to select something that represents everything that's best in the composer in question so that the evil god Cancresans will forswear his horrible intent of eliminating all of classical music but for one work per composer. But if he does leave only one work per composer, it had better be a good one. Max Bruch is a very interesting aesthetic case. Do you know that he died in like the 1920s? And, even Tovey, the great Donald Francis Tovey, the eminent British music critic, musicologist, conductor, composer, and authority on all things musical, said that everybody was amazed that he'd actually lived that long, that he was still alive when he finally died, because his style was hopelessly anachronistic in the 1920s, and it was sort of very conservative from the very beginning. It really, really was. Not only that, but he's known for one work these days, really. Even the Scottish fantasy doesn't get played anymore. It's his First Violin Concerto, which is a delightful work. It's a marvelous work. It's a beautiful, lovely, romantic violin concerto. It deserves every inch of its popularity. But I don't think it gives us all of him. And all of him is a difficult thing to find. In his lifetime, he was known best as a composer of choral music, believe it or not. And I actually saw a live performance of his choral work, Odysseus, and I almost died of boredom. I mean, his choral works are excruciatingly tedious. All the ones I've heard, the Song of the Bell, there's a bunch of others. It wasn't that it's bad music. It's that it was written at a historical time, for the conservative tastes of provincial German audiences. Now, the conservative tastes of provincial German audiences are okay. We like to think, that the great composers from the second half of the 19th century were Brahms and Wagner. The cats are going crazy. But they weren't necessarily the most popular, the most frequently played. Joachim Raff was very popular. He was also writing for provincial German orchestras. Those orchestras and choral societies had limited means, limited resources, limited taste. They were limited. And the musical style that evolved to cater to them was itself very limited. It consisted, musically speaking, aesthetically speaking, of a lot of inhibitions. There were a lot of thou shalt nots. For example, thou shalt not score too extravagantly. Thou shalt not be too daring harmonically. Thou shalt not use excessive percussion. I mean, things like that. Extra instruments, orchestral color for its own sake. Because on the one hand, there was this technical, logistical limitation and resources. On the other hand, there was the limitation in terms of form and content of what you could actually do. Because in the wake of Beethoven and Mozart and those people, the forms of classical music became somewhat ossified and essentially codified in a way that allowed ordinary people who cared about such things and soi-disant music critics and tastemakers to judge works according to a priori theories of what they were supposed to sound like and what shape they were supposed to take. Bruch's First Violin Concerto is successful because it violates the rules, not because it follows them. The first movement is an introduction. It is not a typical concerto sonata form with an orchestral introduction and then the violin comes in. It's none of that. And it leads directly into, it's a passionate introduction that leads directly into the slow movement. And the only fully developed form, traditional form in the whole concerto is the finale. That's unusual. And, not following the rules could really get a composer into trouble. Dvorak, for example, when he wrote his violin concerto, for the same guy, Joseph Joachim, the great Joachim, that Bruch wrote his concerto for, had no problem playing Bruch, refused to play the Dvorak because Dvorak's first movement looks like a traditional first movement, but doesn't do that. It doesn't have a formal recapitulation. It flows into the slow movement. But because it was not formally structured, his publisher begged him to make it longer, to do other things. It's perfect, exactly the way it is. And Dvorak stood his ground, and he revised the violin part to do certain things with it, but Joachim never touched it. I mean, people really cared about things like that back then, and so these formal issues mattered. Bruch's first concerto solves those formal issues, but it's still a rather conservative and small-scaled work. His Scottish fantasy, on the other hand, is much more than that. And it gets away with being much more than that because it's not called a concerto. So nobody had those formal expectations that you would have when you wrote a concerto. It happens to be longer than the First Violin Concerto. It's richer in terms of content, and it's gorgeously scored for an orchestra that includes cymbals and bass drum. Granted, he only uses them in piano, low dynamics, nothing flashy, nothing that's going to question his exquisite taste, but he does. They're there. And a harp, going, because it's Scottish, right? You have Ossian, the bards, and all that stuff, thrumming away at their harp things, their Celtic harps, and it can use folk tunes. And so you can imitate bagpipes. You can do all kinds of things that would raise eyebrows in the more traditionally Germanified major serious forms. And so the Scottish fantasy allows Bruch freedom. It really does. It lets his imagination soar. And he writes an absolutely glorious piece for violin and orchestra that nobody plays, which is insane. He also wrote 2 more violin concertos, which are really pretty good. But no one plays the Scottish fantasy because it's not called a concerto, so people don't take it seriously. But if you listen to it, it's a deeper, more profound work than most of the violin concertos written during the same period, and certainly the best of Bruch's music for violin and orchestra. So there you have it. So the point I want to make to the evil god Cancresans, as well as to the rest of you, is that there is more to Bruch than meets the eye. You just have to know where to look. But we're never going to know where to look if all of his work disappears, except for this one piece. It will only make us curious as to what might have been. And he was a wonderful composer. His chamber music, some of it is just splendid, really gorgeous chamber music. And he wrote Swedish dances, which are delightful. He did some ethnomusicology here and there. Good stuff. Really good stuff. But in the big works that I'm sure he thought were his most important, the symphonies, the concertos, and things like that, well, they could be a little bit hit or miss because the circumstances militated against him having the same kind of free exercise of his fantasy that he was able to use in the Scottish fantasy. So there you have it. There you have it, my friends. It's the Bruch Scottish fantasy. Can't be anything else. Keep on listening, and thank you so much for joining me. Take care.